As we begin, I'd like to acknowledge the first people of the land on which we live and walk and work, and that will be different for all of us in our different places. And we honour those first people and their ancestors for their survival, for their continued traditions, for their spiritual connection and caring of country. And we pay respect to the elders past and present, and will continue to support their right for self-determination. As a church, particularly here in southern Queensland, we are committed to reconciliation and respectfully recognise that sovereignty has never been ceded. And you might like to use the chat box to name the First Nations people of the particular bit of land where you are gathered. For me here, it's Gubbi Gubbi or Cubbi Cubbi people, but it will be different where you are. And as an act of respect, you might like to name them now. So welcome again. A couple of housekeeping things as we start. First, as I asked before, please remember to keep yourself on mute until we get to the point where we'll invite questions from the floor, and there'll be an opportunity, and we'll invite you at that time to unmute yourself to ask the question. Please use the chat down the side of the screen there, and it's a great place to have conversations sort of off to the side, but also to write questions, and we'll keep an eye of that and try and get through all those questions when we get to the question and answer section of the evening. We are recording things, hopefully, if the technology does the right thing. So if you'd rather not appear somehow on a recording, you're welcome to turn your camera off. You could even change your name on the screen if you want to be completely anonymous. But hopefully the recording will be available in coming days once we've had a chance to edit it and get it ready to put up on YouTube. We hope to have about an hour together. After the introductions, I'll invite Martyn to speak to us for 10 or 15 minutes. And then I'll respond with some questions, and then we'll have time for some Q&A after that. So it's a great joy to welcome Martyn this evening. Martyn, who's giving us some time out from a bit of holiday in the north of England, in York. But Martyn is usually the 45th Dean of Christ Church in Oxford, so Dean of both the Cathedral and the University College. He's a former principal of Ripon Theological College at Cuddesdon in Oxford, but he's currently a member of the Faculty of Theology at the University of Oxford, and also tutors in the Social Sciences Division, I think at the Said Business School. He's Professor of Theological Education at King's College London, a professorial research fellow at Haythrop College in the University of London, and a visiting professor at the Centre for the Study of Values at the University of Winchester, amongst a whole lot of other things. He's written numerous books, including Anglicanism, Confidence, Commitment and Communion, 39 new articles, An Anglican Landscape of Faith, and The Futures of Anglicanism, Contours, Currents, Charts. My favourite thing about Martyn is that he's the only living theologian to feature in Dan Brown's The Da Vinci Code. And he's married to Emma, who's chaplain and fellow of Trinity College in Oxford. But Martyn and Emma have 2 adult sons and a wonderfully bouncy dog. His latest book is called The Humble Church, and it's wonderful to have a chance to chat about it this evening. So welcome, Martyn. It's terrific to be with you.
very warm and generous introduction. It's very, very good to see you all. And I know it's evening with you. It's morning here. It's just turned 8:10. And I'm always reminded of just how different our weather patterns are here. Here it's, in theory, getting into high summer. So we'll struggle in this part of England to get to about 20 degrees today. And obviously I've been in Brisbane where it's been winter and it's been nearly 40 degrees. So anyway, I wish you well, and you're very much in my thoughts and prayers at the moment, particularly in lockdown, as are we. And we are, currently, of course, all juggling with the political and cultural and social uncertainties that are taking place in our society. Which of course are within our church as well, and raise pretty fundamental, if not actually outright, existential questions about the nature and purpose of the church, and what are we here for, and what does ministry look like in the context of this global pandemic, and what are our responsibilities to our friends, to our neighbours, to our institutions, and indeed to ourselves as well. So Jeremy's invited me to talk for about 10 minutes or so about some of the themes in the book. I always feel that with any kind of invitation like this, it's much more interesting if we kind of take the book as read on one level. And I talk about some of the things which I think the book points us towards. And we'll see where that discussion takes us. I look forward to questions and to conversation with you. As Jeremy kindly said, I'm the Dean of Christ Church in Oxford. I live in the house which Alice in Wonderland occupied. She was the third daughter of Dean Liddell. She played in our garden. And I also live in a college which has had a lot of filming in Harry Potter. I sometimes have to point out to tourists that Harry Potter was never an undergraduate at Christ Church, Oxford, and that the University of Oxford, to the best of my knowledge, runs no BA degrees in wizardry or anything of the kind, really. But it is an extraordinary institution comprising a cathedral, a college, a choral school, a cathedral school, which has been there since the days of Thomas Wolsey, and will be celebrating its 500th birthday in just 3 years' time. And then if you want to go further back in time, it was an Augustinian priory, and before that it would have been a Saxon convent, beginning probably around the year 690, thereabouts, under the auspices of Freudwald, who was the original woman who founded the convent, and whose remains may or may not be buried in the cathedral next door, depending on what was left after the Reformation. Freudwald was a remarkable woman, and certainly existed. She's referenced in Bede's Ecclesiastical history. And for a long time, the church, the convent at what is now Christ Church, was a centre of pilgrimage and healing in our country, and would have had many travellers from far and wide. So let me begin with just some reflections on the times, I think, in which we are living, and that sense of things being quite strange at the moment to come to terms with. And the question, I suppose, about our position, our composition, and our preparedness to face the present and the future. One of the things I like to do from time to time is collect ecclesiastical jokes. I'm interested in these because I think the capacity to have humour is a really good indication of a denomination or a congregation's capacity to be able to laugh at itself. And I think the more you can laugh at yourself, the more in tune you will be with God's sense of humour. And of course, you're less likely to take yourself too seriously. I think we all know that the book of Jewish jokes runs to several volumes. There are many good books of Catholic jokes. The book of Anglican jokes is slightly thinner. The book of Brethren jokes, on the other hand, is a very slim offering, because the Brethren don't really like humour and tend, on the whole, to be suspicious of laughter. But Anglican jokes are really quite revealing, because they tell us something about our polity, and they tell us something about our identity and our capacity to be the church in the world. So here's one to get us started, and it's an end time joke, and it involves really the angels who are in heaven suddenly noticing some very strange things in the galaxy one day, and they fly into the centre of heaven to meet with the Trinity. And they say, we think the Earth is about to be destroyed by a meteorite, and we think this is pretty imminent, next 48 hours. And so we think we should go down to Earth and give the various church leaders a chance to see who they can turn to be saved in these final days. So the Trinity sign off on this, and the archangels are duly dispatched. And the first one goes, obviously, to Rome, and meets with the Pope, and says, look, the world's about to be destroyed. What is your final message and sermon for the people of this earth, so they may turn to the church and to Christ? And the Pope says, well, you know, officially our position has always been that there's no salvation outside the church. So I'm afraid we're going to be just doing a sermon here on Matthew 16. On this rock I have built my church, and we'll just have to say to people that this is your last chance to get on board the Ark of Salvation. Well, says the angel, interesting, fair enough, I suppose. Not much good news there for the ecumenical movement, but if that's your last sermon, that's your last sermon. It is, says the Pope. Next, the angel flies over to America and meets with the head of the disciples of Christ, and you know, it's a very sort of liberal kind of upstanding denomination that says, well, you know, what's your final message for humanity? To which the response is, well, we're going for a bit of Matthew as well. Matthew 25. When I was hungry, you fed me. When I was naked, you clothed me. When I was in prison, you visited me. Okay, says the angel, that will do, but there's not much time to do that. But I can see that you know, this might work. And then down to the Southern Baptist Convention, which just happens to be meeting that weekend. And again, the angel says, what are you going to do? And they said, well, it's obvious. It's John 3:16. For God so loved the world that whoever turns to Christ will be saved. Whoever believes. That's excellent, says the angel. Marvelous. That's really very decisive. Thank you for that. And then the angel flies back over the Atlantic Ocean and goes straight to Lambeth Palace, walks in, and then straight in to see the Archbishop of Canterbury and says, well, what is your final message for humanity? What are you going to say in these final hours? And the Archbishop sort of says, well, you know, how do you know it's the end of time? The angel says, well, we've seen it, and we're really just after a Bible reading and a final message from you. What's it going to be? To which the Archbishop says, well, I really don't know, but I think we'll use the lectionary. So, what would you use, in fact, if you really had one sermon text and an elevator pitch and just a few moments to explain to people what the rudiments of the gospel are? This is not a question about testimony. It's not a question about personal witness. It's just, what do you think the Bible is trying to tell us? And what do you think is going on in Christianity? One of the reasons I wrote The Humble Church was because, and I can only speak of the Church of England here, but I imagine this will resonate with some of you in the church in Australia, is that the church has got rather too good at self-promotion. And it somehow has assumed that its interests are God's interests, and that the self-interest of the church is entirely bound up with the priorities of God. And I've always been very struck by that extraordinarily interesting sentence in John Robinson's book, The New Reformation, which says the church was only ever meant to be the constructor's hut on the building site, which is the kingdom of God. In other words, what Robinson was trying to say to us was that churches are not intended to be that permanent, not as we imagine, but they are meant to be the places from which the kingdom is built. And the kingdom being built means initiatives in the city, signs of God's love and redemption, costly love and sacrifice. It doesn't necessarily mean anything that is going to result in numerical church growth, congregational growth, an increase in financial giving, or for that matter, in the reputation of the church being somehow enhanced, as though this was an extraordinary exercise in public relations. And were this just a point about the priorities of Jesus and the kingdom as against the church, I think I'd leave it there. But I think one of the things that is always interesting for Christians and for ministers to go back to is to look at the costly expansiveness and expense of Jesus' ministry and realize that an enormous amount of it is given and offered with no expectation of any return whatsoever. 10 lepers healed, only one returns to give thanks. The other 9 do not have theirs withdrawn. They are healed anyway. Over 40 healing miracles in the Gospels. We hardly ever learn the name of anybody who's healed. It's the nameless, the homeless, the marginalized, the demonized, the stigmatized, the people who are beyond the boundaries of faith very often, sometimes deliberately excluded on the basis of their affliction or their foreignness or their identity or their social issues. And Jesus goes out to reach them and touch them. And they are not returned to increase synagogue numbers, nor are they necessarily baptized or confirmed, nor are they, of course, put on an alpha course or anything else like that. So there's something here about the ministry of Jesus being first and foremost, and maybe only, a sign of God's love for humanity in the world. Nothing but that. With the disciples constantly being directed towards not being permitted to spell out the consequences of being touched by the grace, love, mercy, kindness, gentleness, and love of God. So there's a vision here, I think, for the church as being that constructor's hut, a place of non-permanence, which is an agent for building something else in our communities, which in turn therefore means that the kingdom is built sometimes at the expense of the church, but very often the church will grow only as a consequence of the church not looking to its own interests, not looking to its self-promotion, and not being quite so self-consumed. So one of the things that I suggested in the book is that you could think about Jesus as being the verb of God, not just the word of God, but the verb of God. Jesus does what God does. Jesus feels what God feels. Jesus speaks what God speaks. Jesus is the body language of God. He sees the unseen, he hears the unheard, he feels the unfelt and the untouched. He essentially is God's body on earth, and not just the spokesperson for that, but the actor, the verb of God made flesh. So the invitation here is to think about what that would look like for our ministries. And I can see immediately that, practically speaking, it would be tricky for some congregations because they would expect their clergy to be at their beck and call and to be doing lots of good things that make the church agreeable and good and wholesome. But I think the call to ministry is actually something else. It's to be the body language of God in the communities in which we are. Nothing more, nothing less. It's a pretty tall order. But to be that sense of God's inhabiting in our communities so that we feel the pain that God would feel, and we're able to address that in body, mind, and spirit. So there's something here about being intentional about that. When I was a principal at Cuddesdon Theological College, we often used to have folk for whom being technicians of the sanctuary and doing lots of things in liturgy and getting that right was the be-all and end-all. And I sometimes just had to remind people very gently that the original vision for Anglicanism is not a vision for a church. It's not a set of rubrics for a denomination. It's actually a vision for society, out of which the church is a consequence. In other words, the church is not the cause of Anglicanism, it's a consequence of it. Now, if you put it that way round, and you see that the most important thing to begin with about Anglicanism was that it had a social vision for the kingdom and for practicing Christianity, practical faith, and for being the verb of God in our communities. It's from that that the church is a consequence. But too often we put it the other way around. We just assume that we can't do anything socially unless we've got the church right. And actually our work is to be socially engaged and seeing the world and being in the world and acting in the world as God would and does, as much as we can, from which the church becomes a consequence. Now, I well know that, of course, in these strange times that we live in, we have been turned inward by the pandemic, and many of us have found ourselves, in effect, living in a kind of imposed exile. And it's taken me back, I think, to those Old Testament times when the Israelites, I think, wondered why they were displaced, why they were marginalized, and why they felt far from home. By the waters of Babylon, we sat down and we wept when we remembered Zion. But I think one of the interesting things about the Old Testament is that the message of the exile is very often that there's very little you can do to get out of it, because there is a secret of the kingdom in there in God's timing. It's about refining, it's about recalibrating, it's about redrawing the boundaries, it's about learning lessons of intentional patience, and it's about waiting. And above all, it's about being faithful. There's almost nothing that you can do in an Old Testament exile to get back to Zion quicker. And every time, I think, we find the Israelites trying to negotiate their way out of either a coming exile or an actual exile, prophets are raised up to say, well, you're going to have to wait. The Old Testament is all about waiting. And it's waiting for the church or the Israelites to be called back in order to be a new faithful community in a land from which they had been evicted or removed or displaced. I think our time at the moment as Christians is a time of growing exile. I think it's increasingly harder to use our public voice as Christians.
You're just dropping out a bit there, Martyn.
Whether that's genuine.
We seem to have lost Martyn just for the moment. We'll try and reconnect him. But while we're waiting, you might like to start thinking about questions or reflections. I think one of the really challenging things that Martyn has to say about how we might be church in that sense of Jesus as the verb of God is how that sits over against that sense of urgency that we all feel from time to time about keeping things going and growing the church, and that endless drive to do more and more. And Martyn again and again suggests perhaps we need to pause and wait. So have a think about some of those questions, and I invite you to use the chat to do that. If we don't get Martyn back, we can talk amongst ourselves. We'll see. One of the things that John V. Taylor wrote in The Go-Between God is that the mission of the church is to live the ordinary life of men. He was writing a long time ago. The mission of the church is to live the ordinary life of men in that extraordinary awareness of the other and self-sacrifice for the other, which the Spirit gives. And at the heart of Martyn's book is this idea that we should start with the God of John 1, the incarnation. And I think Martyn's coming back. Start with the God of the incarnation and the God of Philippians 2, so that sense of the incarnation and this God who empties God's self into the world. Yeah.
Jeremy, I'm here.
You're back. Terrific.
Yeah, I am. Thank you very much. Sorry. I don't know. I think we just got zoned out there. I would blame your Wi-Fi for that. Very good. So let me just conclude with this. I mean, I think one of the things that is interesting for us to reflect on today is, what does it look like to be a self-emptying church, a kenotic church, a humble church? And this is all rooted really in the Christological hymn in the Philippians. Christ Jesus, though in the form of God, did not cling to equality with God, but emptied himself, taking the form of a servant. Being found in human form, humbled himself and became obedient even unto death. And therefore God has highly exalted him and bestowed on him the name above every name, that at the name of Jesus every knee should bow in heaven and on earth. So that deliberate taking out, that removal, as it were, of your power, your privilege, your prestige, and seems to me to be incredibly important for us as a church today. What would it look like to be a self-emptying, kenotic, humble church? Anyway, I shall stop there. Apologies for the ad break. I'm not sure what you did while I was away.
Oh, thank you so much. We talked about you while you were gone. So, but those final comments is a lovely segue, because I was just sharing with people a quote from John V. Taylor, who said, "The mission of the church is to live the ordinary life of men in that extraordinary awareness of the other and self-sacrifice for the other which the Spirit gives," which seems to me to tie in with both the Philippians 2 stuff, but also the John 1 stuff about the incarnation. And so lovely bit of a connection there. Taylor says Christian activity will be very largely the same as the world's activity: earning a living, bringing up a family, celebrating, mourning, doing all those things. But Christians will try and do those things to the glory of God, which is to say, they will try and perceive what God is up to in each of these activities and seek to do it with God. So I wonder, how you see all of that sitting alongside, that sense of urgency that some of us who are sort of paid professional religious people have to sort of keep things going. So, our parishes can keep the doors open and the lights on and the stipends get paid. Or do we, it's incredibly scary, I think, to say, we abandon that and do things so very differently.
Yeah. I mean, I think we don't abandon that, because I think part of actually giving glory to God is worship, and worship, of course, is not just what we do on Sundays. It's as you say, it's what we do at meals. It's what we do with raising a family and much else besides. Really, I suspect this is really about understanding that the purpose of the church is not self-perpetuation. It's not, we need more construction huts. We need to be constantly asking ourselves, what are we building in this community? And how are we of service and value to our neighbours? Whereas I think very often we're just thinking, well, we need to be more attractive to our neighbours so that more of them come in. And I'm not here as it were being, anti-evangelistic. I'm just saying that the priority for Jesus was not, it seems to me, to be gathering people to make a bigger critical mass to fill synagogues. His work was his Father's work, and that was the work of building the kingdom of God. I mean, in our own country, we had in the early 1980s a report called Faith in the City, which was very much about the work of the churches in our urban priority areas and what it was doing to, or trying to do, to combat poverty and social disadvantage and much else besides. It was given a pretty sort of rough ride from the right-wing press at the time, even called by one newspaper a Marxist report. But of course, Faith in the City was an intentional pun in the title by its authors. It was about faith in the city. It was about the project that the churches and Christians are supposed to have in the city. They're supposed to have faith in the city. Whereas I think actually many people read this title as, how can we have faith and be Christians in our city? It was the wrong way round, really. And I'm just very struck by this, that we too often assume that the interests of the church and the concerns of the church are what we allied with society. And I think the point of a kenotic ministry is to say, this isn't about us. It's not even about survival. It's first and foremost about being present and engaged in communities and serving them. Part of that will be keeping the church open, but a lot of it will be around Anglicare, food banks, credit unions, work with schools, and seeking the lost.
It's a huge shift, though. I had a conversation with a struggling parish recently about what it might look like for them as a parish to kind of give up their life for the community. So if they were to decide, the 5 of them who are left, that they can't keep going, we'll shut up shop, sell the buildings, and invest that money somehow in the community. And yet, for those 5 people, it's been their life's work to keep the doors open and to keep things going. So how do we invite people to see that different vision and take them on that journey?
Yeah. Well, the answer is, Jeremy, I'm not the bishop, but but I don't think it's easy, and I don't envy you. And I think if I was sitting alongside that group of 5, as you would be, I think it's a medium to long conversation, isn't it? Because I think there are a number of things to get past people. So one thing I think is that some of these church buildings, quite independent of the fact of whether they are staffed, whether there are any stipendiary clergy there at all, they're going to have an aesthetic and spiritual value, quite independent of whether anybody turns up. As Larkin says, a place where prayer is valid. I mean, going into a country church, I think anywhere in the world, but certainly in England, and finding it empty is not a bad spiritual experience. So one thing that can be affirmed here is that actually by keeping the building going, you are still doing something profoundly spiritual in the community. You've got a question to ask about the numbers that you would do. Then I think there's another question, which is, was faced by our Victorian forebears. Do you put more money into more curates? Or do you, for example, say, right, actually what this parish really needs is a parish nurse, somebody to actually visit the elderly and the isolated in their communities, not, as it were, with gospel tracts and so forth, but with encouragement and basic medical care and community. And I think I'm sure you get it in Australia, but you'll know the TV series called The Midwife, which is actually based on a project begun by Dean Liddell from Christchurch in the 1850s, which was a St Friars-wide hostel in London. And it was to look after unmarried pregnant women and give them a better experience of birth and raising children. And parish nurse schemes were born out of that. So I think there can be Christian community action, which is a very powerful sign of what the gospel can do for people in communities, without that necessarily being something that has to be brought into, well, how does this make the numbers run? Now, whether there's enough capital left from the sale of, let's say, 3 buildings to do that and to keep 2 buildings open, I can't answer that one. But I'm not suggesting that we withdraw. I'm suggesting that what we do is say to some of our churches, look, our work now may be different. And it might not be about attracting people to come to church. It might be about being powerful agents of social change and ambassadors for Christ in communities, where we are actually really doing some of that very first work that Jesus was doing by seeking the lost and the ill, the diseased, the demonized, in Galilee and beyond.
I'm very happy to keep conversation going, but I'd certainly invite others to join. And so if you have questions, put them in the chat and we'll invite you to ask them. That'd be terrific. But Martyn, while we're waiting for that, I wonder, where are the signs of hope that you see in the church? I mean, in the Church of England, emerging from lockdown, I think you're back with face-to-face worship now. That hasn't been happening very long, so it's a very strange time to be the church. But where are the signs of hope?
Okay, I mean, I think there are signs of hope, but I'll deal with the challenges first, and because I'm figuring these may strike a chord. I think that we have got congregations coming back to worship face to face, but they're still being socially distant. Our age demographic for Anglicans, by and large, is north of 60. We do have some evangelical and charismatic churches with significant numbers of younger people in them. My observation about them is that they're still very good with fellowship, but the quality and the content of Christian knowledge amongst the young is evaporating at a very alarming rate. Hymns are not sung in schools unless you go to a private fee-paying school. You will not find the Bible taught. So we have an entire generation now of folk being raised who have very little exposure to explicit Christian knowledge. And that means that even some of the people who are flocking to evangelical churches, it's not quite what it seems. They'll be fairly relaxed about their Muslim or Hindu neighbours and friends. They'll be pretty relaxed about sexuality. They'll be gender inclusive. And in fact, as a colleague of mine says, for the emerging generation, values is the new religion. It's actually all about equality, diversity, fairness, and justice. That leads me to my first challenge, which is, I think, is the church is a long way behind the curve here, unfortunately, and we're not really, certainly in the Church of England, keeping pace with this very significant cultural change amongst our young people. And the risk of that will be disassociation at some point, which I think is already taking place. The second thing, I think, for our other age demographic, the older folk, and of which I'm nearly one, is that they are coming together and they're supportive, but they're much more wary. And I see lots of evidence of those numbers beginning to tail off and people adapting their patterns of believing and belonging. So, regular church going used to mean every Sunday, sometimes twice a Sunday. Regular church going now means twice a month, that's regular. So words that we use have become slightly stretchy. The third thing I think that's a challenge for us is that a lot of things on, the internet and Zoom Church and Teams have worked very well. I mean, Christchurch Cathedral, our Matins congregation used to be 30 or so in the choir and 30 or so in the congregation. Beautiful music, usually very erudite sermons, as long as I wasn't preaching, that sort of thing. And under lockdown, we were getting 400, 500, 600 people tuning in to Matins, but we can't really tell very much about how they're tuning in. They're probably still in their pajamas, drinking their coffee. And I think we'll find that a number of people think, well, actually, if I can do this from my home and not drive into Oxford, try and find a parking space, get a parking ticket, only be allowed to park for 90 minutes anyway, I can do this from home. So I think we might find actually people want to actually engage with church quite differently. Where's the hope? The hope, I think, lies in chaplaincy, whether that's armed services, prison, schools, but chaplaincy is often the church on the world's turf but on the world's terms. And I guess that's what I'm really trying to press here, which is actually, to get hold of that Robinson notion of the constructor's hut, and to see ourselves at service to our communities, building what the community needs to be a better, more wholesome, more godly place. I see signs too of churches becoming more radical and more daring. And by that I mean just thinking, well, okay, we can maintain our numbers, but actually what we're actually going to do is about our, it's food banks in our community, it's shelter for the homeless, it's credit unions. And those are the signs of hope I see at the moment, because they're not actually about building up numbers. And I think building up numbers, certainly in the Church of England, has become something of a mug's game. Every time we try and build up the numbers, we actually make it worse. And I think the only solution here is to sort of figure out that, sometimes if you try too hard, you're going to put more people off than you switch on, really.
Thanks. There's a question from Luke Hopkins. Luke, if you'd like to unmute and ask your question.
Hello, Martyn.
Hi, Luke.
Thank you for your presentation and for the new book. Stemming from the book, I think you've already really answered this, but I wondered if you might say a little bit more, particularly to those who are discerning or being trained for ministry, for ordained ministry at the moment. Following on, it's been a couple of years since you were at Cuddesdon. What's some of the advice you might give to students now, knowing that I'm sure you're still in contact with that community?
Yeah, very much so. I think I'm going to claim a rare thing here that politicians usually can't claim here, which is consistency. And I remember being interviewed in one of those unwise experiments that seminarians and ordinands sometimes have. They decided to have a college magazine, and they thought that one of the things that would really get the first edition of this hot off the press and read by everybody was an interview with the principal, which was me. But actually, it turned out to be a rather interesting interview, and the woman who was interviewing me, also an ordinand, said, towards the close of the interview, what do you think you're trying to do here? It's a really rather good question, actually. And I thought, yes. And I said, well, I think I'm trying to take good people and make them even more good, which I know sounds sort of almost banal and Platonic and Aristotelian, but I do think it's about goodness and about kindness, therefore, and gentleness, and all the things that would flow from goodness. And what it led me on to say is, I said, I can cope with recommending anybody for ordination. They can be a terrible preacher, they can have halitosis, they can be awful administrators, but they have to be good. They really do have to be good people, and they have to be full of goodness, and they have to be, as it were, understanding that what they're about is occupation. So it's not a profession that they're going into, it's not a job, it's an older world, it's an occupation. And that occupation consists of this: being as occupied with God as you possibly can be, being as occupied with the concerns that you think God has for this world, and then being occupied with the people around you and their concerns and hurts as you occupy that space. It's all about occupation. And that's what the incarnation is too. It's Jesus being the verb of God, and Jesus is fully occupied with God, by God. He's fully preoccupied with what's going on around him, but he's not self-occupied. So I think that would be it. And I think, seminarians, we all can get terribly preoccupied with, the right way to do liturgy, the right length of a sermon, ecclesiastical tat, and goodness knows what else. But actually, this is about goodness, and it's about occupation, and it's fundamentally about understanding that the call is to be the verb of God in the communities that we've been set in. So that's a hard charge, because I think it's much easier sometimes to get distracted by the church. And just as I think, to go back to the constructor's hut, it's much more tempting, isn't it, to sort of do up the constructor's hut and to make it as good as you can, and to add a wing and to do this, that, and the other. It's just not the job. The job is building the kingdom in the community, for which there actually may not be much thanks to you, but it's still the job. And the job is to be good and to be as occupied with God as you could possibly be. One of my predecessors at Cuddeston used to run a club on Mondays called the God on Monday Club. Great, and any ordinand could come. And the club had only one rule. You could only talk about God. Couldn't talk about anything else. You weren't allowed to talk about church politics, ecclesiastical preferment, new styles in, clergy Roman collars. Couldn't talk about the lectionary. Couldn't slag off your neighbour. You could only talk about God. And as he said after his stint as principal, it was very strange how nearly every one of those God on Monday Club meetings passed in complete silence. Because only talking about God is quite difficult. But only talking about God is all we're asked to do. Hope that's helpful. Yeah.
Thank you. Jan Crombie, you had a question.
Oh, yes, thank you. And thank you, Martyn, for your book. I kept ticking all the things I agreed with, then I stopped because the book was getting so covered in pencil. But I'm really, because we are trying to do something here in the faith community I'm part of, is how do we actually equip people to do that listening? I think you call it the listen and learn in your book, of engagement with the community. And we have in the diocese a new vision statement before us, and there's one sentence that's in amongst it all that says, the nature and location of a faith community will shape what it means for us to flourish. And in many ways, I think we haven't put a lot of emphasis on that, about how we actually are particular about where we are as a faith community and how significant that must be. We can't import or impose broad programs or processes. We need to listen and do it from the ground up. But over in England, have you created resources to equip people to do that community listening, to engage?
I think some of us are trying. I think, if I'm honest, and here I think I would have to be critical of should we say, current management in the Church of England, is that we've locked ourselves onto broadcast mode, and we have not really been on listening mode. And that seems to me to be a real problem for us at the moment. The assumption is that a small group of people know what the gospel is, and they know what the world wants to hear, and they just make it, like the proverbial Englishman abroad. They just keep shouting louder, because obviously, if people haven't got the message, they must be a bit deaf. So we'll just keep sort of, keep going and keep shouting. And of course, it makes Christianity, in C.S. Lewis's words, not poor talkative, but rather annoying and shouty. And whereas I think the lesson that we take from John 1 and incarnation and Jesus being the body language of God, and Paul's hymn in Philippians 2, is that there's an inbuilt reciprocity in the nature of the incarnation. If you look at the ministry of Jesus, he permits himself to be changed and directed by the people he's with. He doesn't start with a ministry to people beyond the cordons and frontiers of Judaism. But once he begins to travel and to get out into places like, Phoenicia and Tyre and Sidon and the eastern shores of the sea and the Galilee, Gadarene and so forth, he begins to find faith, and he begins to encounter extraordinary people who don't have any Jewish background, who are nonetheless transformed and committed to this kingdom project. So that's a learning exercise. And I think, we often talk about Jesus the teacher, but actually Jesus the teacher is also Jesus the learner. And one of the things he's teaching us in the Gospels is how to be listening and learning and engaging with faith that we wouldn't expect to find in places that we haven't yet broadcast to. I don't think there's anything difficult about this theologically or doctrinally, because it's all there in pneumatology, and Jeremy was quoting John V. Taylor earlier on. It's there in the go-between God. The church moves out of its comfort zone, not to take the gospel, but to find it sometimes, to actually realize that there are people out there doing wonderful and good things and godly things, which actually we need to receive. And so I think this is, it's got something to do with humility, it's something to do with timidity, something to do with bravery, requires a little bit of courage. But what it really requires, I think, is just to switch the kind of circuit in the church, which at the moment is completely wired towards broadcasting and gaining more numbers, as though this was a global popularity contest. Which, I don't think we can win it, because, there's just too much noise and visual stimulation and much else going on to win that. I think we've actually got to get out there and immerse ourselves in our communities and find out from them what they want. Thank you.
Well, Martyn, thank you. Thank you so much. I was reflecting earlier today. Thomas Hullick, who's a Jesuit writer, wrote recently on the pandemic, and he said, we can either use this time of sort of closed churches as a reminder of what's to come, or we can use it as an opportunity to reimagine an identity for Christianity, he says. And this reimagining is part of, I think, what you're talking about in the book, that huge shift from the way that we've been doing things, and that endless broadcast. And Jan, I thought when you mentioned the vision statement, having read what Martyn's written about strategic plans and things, I thought we were going to go down a rabbit hole there. I was very pleased that you restrained yourself, Martyn. Terrific. But there is a shift in thinking, and a shift in the way that we might be as church, and that great challenge. If Jesus is the verb of God, what does that mean for us? And so Martyn, thank you so much. For those of you who haven't read the book, I absolutely encourage you to rush out and buy it. But for those of you who have, you'll appreciate Martyn's wisdom and grace and gentle way of communicating some really challenging stuff. So thank you so much, Martyn. Thanks for giving up an hour on a Thursday morning when you could be outside in that 20-degree heat.
yeah, feel the warmth. But thank you, Jeremy, very much, and thank you for your invitation, and all prayers for you in Brisbane and in the diocese. And I'm sorry we couldn't get out to you as we hoped to do one of your conferences, but I hope it won't be too long before we can. We think of our time with you as being very special, and we really enjoyed being amongst you and learning a lot from you. Thank you.
Thank you. The time will come. And thank you to everyone who joined us this evening. I'm hosting another of these conversations in about a month's time with Miranda Threlfall Holmes, who's written a book about how we might read the scriptures. It's called How to Eat Bread, 21 ways to read the scriptures. So if you're interested in that, look forward to seeing you all again in a month's time. But for now, Martyn can enjoy his next cup of tea and we can head off for a gin and tonic to finish the day.
Absolutely. Great.